I'm not a rich man. This is evidenced by the fact that I just now got a PS4, and it was a decision that saw me foregoing food for a week. Yeah, I did it even though I knew I couldn't, because quite frankly, I was tired of waiting. What was I waiting for? I was waiting to play Bloodborne. I am a huge Souls fan. The first game that I bought a PS3 for was Demon Souls. I played that game and it was a revelation. A game that made me feel the story instead of telling me about it. It never occurred to me that this was a way to tell a story. Now, is the story perfect? Nah, it's full of holes and doesn't really make a whole lot of sense as a story. I mean, it's more of like an amalgamation of short stories ending in not so great ways for the people involved. The story didn't start getting interesting until Dark Souls, which had what could be loosely construed as a story, and what was there was vague enough to get people's brains a-going on fan theories. Still though, less than perfect, not really considered a story. Why, you might be asking yourself? Well, first off, a story has a protagonist with needs and wants. Dark Souls, by its nature, is missing these motivations. You spend most of the game not being entirely sure what your motivation is. Bloodborne, however, did it right, and in this video I want to talk about what Bloodborne did and why this storytelling formula should be adopted by more publishers in the future, and maybe by just storytellers in general. First, I want to say this. I have not read any of the fan theories. I know there's a 90-page essay that was written about the story, and as far as I know, it only digs into what the surface level of the story is, but see, as a writer myself, I'm far more interested in what's going on under the surface of the story. Alright, so let's talk about theme. Yeah, all good stories start with this. A theme, or as I like to call it, orientation, is the underlying message of a story. So, for example, the story of The Last of Us on the surface may seem like, can a man and a girl survive an apocalypse? Yeah, that's the surface level story, but this doesn't quite cover what the story is actually about. The orientation of The Last of Us is, in reality, can a father learn to love again when his only daughter dies in his arms?
Don't do this to me, baby. Don't do this to me, baby. I'm doing that.
Yes, you are. Look, there's enough here that you have to feel some sort of obligation to me, so you get her to tell me.
You're right. You're not my daughter. And I sure as hell ain't your dad.
Okay. Now that is a much more impactful story, which can be pulled off in any setting. If you set the game in a post-apocalyptic world, now the story has been kicked off into fifth gear. Now we have all the ingredients for what could be a successful story. So what's the orientation of Bloodborne? Okay, now, bear with me here, but I believe that the story is actually about there is nothing more terrifying than being insignificant. Souls and Born stories are written deliberately vague. The purpose, I believe, is to allow for interpretation of the story. So I think I want to start by talking about the method of storytelling here. It uses subtraction instead of addition of information that makes you put the pieces together yourself. Miyazaki has said in interviews that he was not a talented reader as a child, and the books that he read in English were at times vague because he didn't fully understand them. This left him with only his imagination to fill in the voids of information. He used this subtractionist theory in his own stories, and in the medium of video games, I think it's worked wonderfully. And before I push on through this video, I really want to state that this is just an opinion, and it'll be a weird one, admittedly, but I believe this story is about the phases we go through in life, and those phases are represented by two ideas: knowledge and fear. Bloodborne shows us the stages of life through showing us what we are afraid of, and how knowledge grants us the ability to be fearful of much more scarier existential problems that face us as we age. Stick with me here. In order for me to really state my case, I will run through several points that strengthen this idea in categories which exist in the game. So, let's dig into it, shall we? Bloodborne. Even the name has born in it, and it plays double duty here, both to describe the way a pathogen spreads, but also the way a child is birthed. There is no birth without blood, and blood is where most diseases live. These two themes work together to further the narrative of strength through the letting of blood, but also the damage of mind by both the violence, you being referred to as a beast, and the knowledge of the truth of the universe. I believe all of this is incredibly strong evidence that this story is not what it seems on the surface, but is instead one long simile for the fears we experience throughout our birth and eventual old age, and the stages of that fear. Now let's talk about insight. Now this refers to sight inside one's self. Right? To see inside ourselves, to see what is really outside of us. Madman's insight shows cosmic dust spewing from its skull, and this gives you the ability to see more of the hidden game world below. I think the reference to giving someone eyes is in reality a reference to the pineal gland. I believe the reason the game takes place at night is to solidify the idea that the player is asleep, and the world he or she is experiencing is a dream. The pineal gland is what some people in certain circles call the third eye. But in reality, it's gotten its name from its reaction to light, in that it produces melatonin in response to the circadian cycles at night, typically. This connection is further enhanced by Lovecraft's own story, From Beyond, where a scientist is able to stimulate the pineal gland through resonant waves, and the patient is able to transcend into an alien dimension. It's also said that when we dream, it is our subconscious speaking to us, revealing things that we would not see otherwise. This connects to my original theory in a couple of ways and explains why the game starts out with werewolves, moves into snakes and spiders, then to pregnancy, and last to cosmic horror. Because insight represents the knowledge granted by age. When we're children, we are afraid of very little. We only become wizened by events recorded by our amygdala. There's more on that later. Which tells us that falling off the couch could really hurt, so we shouldn't do that anymore. But until we experience it, we do not fear it. Mostly we're afraid of things that we've never seen, or the unknown, like monsters, werewolves, strange men, and witches, things living underneath of our bed. We fear doctors, we fear needles and blood. It's also the time when we receive our vaccinations from disease. Hence the opening scene of you receiving blood to heal and protect you. Vaccinations are created from dead viruses which used to live in blood. Therefore, we are quite literally fighting diseases with blood. As we age into teenage years and beyond, we become afraid of more tangible things, real things like snakes, spiders, stuff that actually exists in life. And in Bloodborne, that fear is increased through twisting the logic of simple creatures being made into writhing, twisting, mutating masses. This could signify the body horror of growing up, the growing pains, so to speak. Also, notice the snakes are not just twisted together, but they're in a tryst, which is how snakes mate, perhaps symbolizing a teenage need to mate and reproduce that the teenager is barely aware of. As adults, these tangible fears become intensified as we are introduced to adulthood and the tragedy of losing loved ones, grandparents, etc., and finally pregnancy. The ultimate human gamble. This is when we learn to truly fear the unknown and the possibility of losing everything we love, or the possibility of giving birth to a monster, both physically or emotionally. The cosmic part of this being the final stage is the fear of society ripping itself apart, or the fear of the cosmos, that we are just a tiny, insignificant dot in a vast ocean of meaningless nothing set adrift amidst a sea of gas. It's the revelation of the elderly about to reach their death, watching from a wheelchair as the world continues its pattern of life and death, and the realization that you are nothing, along with the universe and everyone in it. The realization that the universe doesn't blink when you die. You could chalk this up to a twist ending, or that was just a way to ramp up the horror, but by increasing the crazy as you go, but stories advance a certain way on purpose. So the order of these events occurring is important, even if the one writing it doesn't realize it at first. Now I'm going to try and strengthen my argument for the pregnancy part of this by talking about pale blood. Now, you could easily read into pale blood as being the blood of the kin, right? But as far as I remember, none of the kin actually bled blood. Hitting some of these cosmic horrors, like the one right before you fight Rom, the one that looks like a flower, that one doesn't spew pale blood, it spews cosmic dust. So what is pale blood? Well, maybe I'm just missing it, but here's what I think it is. Pale blood could be another word for embryonic fluid. Embryonic fluid's been described as clear but tinted yellow, meaning it has very little discernible color. The definition of pale is light in color or having very little color. Yosefka's blood vial is clearly pale blood, as it is much more powerful than the blood of humans and is clear but tinted yellow, just like embryonic fluid. It is of her own concoction. She is also creating these creatures that are eerily similar to fetal children, albeit with malformed heads, which could also be a nod to the horror of giving birth to a child with birth defects. How about the umbilical cords? The umbilical cord is the thing that ties you to the old ones. It could be in reference to cultures that used to chew off the cord in some cases or eat it. From Wikipedia, there's a human placentophagy, I want to say that right, after childbirth is touted by some as being a treatment for postpartum depression and fatigue, among other health benefits, right? The postpartum depression could explain the crying woman in white with the bloody stain on her dress, but not necessarily the blood. It's more likely that the woman is mourning the loss of her child, the hunter is mourning the loss of his wife, and this whole horror show is a way to deal with it. And the birthing chamber. The moment in the Nightmare of Menses where you're walking towards a loft in the distance with a bright light that drives you mad seems to come from nowhere. But upon thinking about it, I believe that loft is a royal birthing chamber, a place supposed to symbolize the birth of a new child. And in Chinese culture, and I believe in some other Asian cultures, for instance, the father is not typically present for the birth of the child, so the father must wait outside as the child is being born. As with everything in this game, the horror comes from the unknown. Imagine the unimaginable horror of waiting for the birth of a child completely unaware that there may be complications or that the child may have a birth defect or you may lose both your wife and your child in birth. These are all very real possibilities, things that you have to deal with and things that you don't know could come true until after they've already happened. Now, how about the Nightmare of Menses? It's awfully close to the word menses, isn't it? Which is another word for when a woman has her period. It can't be a coincidence. It's got to be purposeful. It certainly can be a nightmare to see your pregnant wife bleeding because it usually means the baby is not healthy, or in some sad cases, already dead. In-game, we see a woman, presumably the queen or princess, with blood all over the front of a white gown. Now let's talk about the amygdala. See, the amygdala is a part of the brain that regulates functions such as fear, anger, and sadness. It's also what regulates aggression, a huge mechanic in the game. The amygdala is so important to the story that it is the name of a central boss in the campaign, and aggression becomes a mechanic in the game with the health regain system, having you fly into fits of rage anytime you lose health, smashing the button in your controller to get your health back. The effect is so subtle that I bet you didn't even realize it was happening. But it was. The game is actually using your frustration and your anger to drive the gameplay forward and to reinforce all of its themes. It's quite brilliant. And it's been said that the prefrontal lobotomies were done back in the dark ages of psychology because when the amygdala is removed or otherwise damaged, a flatness of affect was produced, which was seen as a desirable trait in relation to the more aggressive schizophrenic traits. The amygdala also helps in a determination of long-term memories. So, for example, if after learning something that becomes a short-term memory, stress hormones are produced, it is found that in lab mice, those memories are retained much more often than without stress hormones being introduced. So it can be safely reasoned that the amygdala helps keep memories of dangerous, embarrassing, or sad events in your life in order to preserve you or your happiness. Why is this important? Because those three emotions are what drive the narrative and the gameplay. Now, how about Mikolash in the cage? Now, Mikolash is a very well-designed character with a simple aesthetic that can tell you a lot about him. He is without internal eyes or insight, as evidenced by him asking you for eyes, yet he retreats from you. He hints that the only way to be given eyes is to die in the dream, just like you did for Rom, the vacuous spider. Why does he wear a cage on his head? It represents the cage of the adult mind, the idea that we trap ourselves into ideas of ourselves, or that we trap ourselves into relationships or jobs or anything. We are in a cage that we voluntarily wear, and only death can grant us the eyes to see what's beyond this life, to know that it's all so fruitless. But he fears that knowledge, for he knows that his own insignificance will be revealed, so he runs from us until he traps himself at the end of the fight in yet another cage, where death is his only escape. Alright, stillborn babies. Wow, yeah, no. Not a great topic, but stillborn babies are born dead, either peripartum or postpartum, meaning they are dead prior to birth or during. You know, if we're going to go with the theme that this is centered around the body horror of birth and the psychological horror of stillbirth, this part is incredibly important. The messengers are clearly children, partly because of their size, but also because of little things like their semi-bald heads. Their need to play dress up and the fact that they're missing teeth, and the teeth they do have look like baby teeth. The biggest giveaway here is the size of their heads. They look like newborns, and since they are decayed husks, it's reasonable to believe that they may have been stillborns. Now, further enforcing the theme of this game to be about the fear of pregnancy and all the horrors that could come from it. At least until we get to the whole Lovecraft thing. Now, the moon. The moon's pretty important. The moon represents the phases of your life. When it's small, you are young. When it's large and red, you're an adult and wizened by experience. Destroying Rom is akin to conquering a fear and gaining insight to truth, and this progression makes you go into the next stage of your life. This just so happens to be the stage when we see the miscarriage for the first time and when we see the blood moon, and just so happens to be when the prostitute becomes pregnant. All the themes here suddenly matured. The last progression in the game is in as much as age is after you fight Gurman, and if you haven't eaten the umbilical cord, you become old and wheelchair bound, hopeless to watch the young folk make the same mistakes you did. So, in conclusion, I think that the story is trying to say that when we are young, we see as children do, with inexperienced eyes, but as we age and the sunset of our life comes up on the horizon, we see the true horrors that wait for us in life. I could keep going with my analysis, but I think I've made my point. The story is up to interpretation. Now, I'm not going to make assumptions here and say that this is what Miyazaki meant when he was designing this game's story, but it is what I got out of it. It's the reason I made this video. It inspired me because before I learned about structure and plot, I used to write this way. Not because I was ignorant, but because I wanted people to fill in their own gaps, to guess at the motivations through seeing what my characters did as opposed to me just telling them why. Now, I've since learned to my chagrin that being vague doesn't get you published, but I can appreciate it when someone like Miyazaki believes in the power of imagination enough to let us craft our own stories in his video games. It's the reason I still play Fallout games to this day. I mean, why Planescape Torment and all the Infinity Engine games stick in my mind as playgrounds for my imagination. Alright, well, I'm going to go ahead and wrap it up here. Please, if you like this video, please make sure you like and comment, and if you want to see more content like this, hit that subscribe button. And I also want to put out a personal thanks to all the people who checked out my Morrowind video. it inspired me in a pretty dark time in my life to keep making videos. So I want to thank you all for all the positivity, the likes and the subs. It's stuff like that that keeps me going on this sometimes frustrating platform of YouTube. So anyway, this has been a rant from Strat-Edgy, and now that you've heard it, go play some games.